I was raised by a Zionist family. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. My family talks about our spirit of resistance and resilience constantly. If I can overcome my pro-Israel bias and learn about this conflict, so can you.
I don't think I could ever live in Israel again. How can I live in a society that's just declared that some people are more equal than other people? It's like if you were to ask me, could you live in a Christian America where Congress declared that America's a Christian nation and everyone else doesn't count as much?
I objected to serve in the Israeli military because I refused to serve the apartheid regime of Israel.
The fact that I refuse to join the army is my way of showing I won't be a part of this oppressive system.
What do you guys say to all these people who say, without Israel, Jews would be killed? Israel is the only reason we haven't had another Holocaust.
It's such a big lie that in the beginning we're a bit paralyzed when we try to challenge it because it's so false.
Look, if we all agree that it's anti-Semitic to associate all Jews everywhere with the actions of the state of Israel, the problem is that Israel purports to be the state for all Jews everywhere.
Right.
So everything Israel does impacts on all of us. And when Israel acts oppressively, that makes us patently unsafe.
Yeah, can you talk about that? That, as you just said, people conflate the two things. So can you guys talk about that?
Yeah.
Roz, do you want to take us?
Well, we can all talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is such a category mistake.
The idea that criticizing Israel is the same thing as being anti-Semitic is so deeply embedded in people's minds. But criticizing a government's policies is not the same thing as hating an entire ethnicity. But as Ilan Pappe said, one of the Jewish voices that you just saw me lip-syncing to, a lot of work needs to be done to unpack that. Not because it's complicated, because actually the issue is quite simple. This is an occupation. But even though sometimes something can be simple, that doesn't make it easy. Just take any long-standing, destructive, or toxic thought or belief that you have. The answer to that is seeing the truth. So it sounds very simple, but actually seeing the truth is usually very hard. But even though it's hard to face the truth and speak it, it's actually possible. And that's why I selected those Jewish voices this week that I'm lip syncing to, because they speak the truth, even though it's at the risk of them being called traitors in their own society. And in this video, I'm going to get into the background of these Jewish people that I have a lot of respect to for speaking the truth and how they came to have a pro-Palestinian stance. And also in the video, I'm going to get into my background as a Palestinian and how that part of my identity was something I've always been, I'm ashamed to say that I was ashamed of saying it. Because, you know, when you say you're Palestinian, especially here like in Europe, there's always an electric charge to it. You can't just say I'm Palestinian and walk away. You either get the, oh wow, we stand with your people, or oh my God, like there's always, it can't just be the end of the discussion. It's not as simple as saying, oh, I'm Danish or Swedish. So sometimes I just avoid saying it. But what's happening right now made me feel like, no, goddammit, I am Palestinian. I'm gonna own it. So I'm gonna get into that in the video as well, and the trauma behind hiding your identity, because that's something also we have in common with Jewish people who actually, especially the people that I picked for this week's video, they say that because they are Jewish and because of their Jewish tradition, they will stand with Palestinians. But also that has a lot of trauma behind it. And if you follow my channel, you know I do drag as a form of therapy, and I literally call myself a drag therapist. But to quote Alan Watts, who I've lip synced to as well before, he calls himself a spiritual entertainer. And kind of that's how I think of myself. Even though I'm here to entertain, my spirit right now cannot think of anything but Gaza. I try to peel myself away from it, but I just can't. And for some reason, the only thing that gives me comfort is actually hearing Jewish people stand up for Palestinians. I don't know what it is. Like, it just makes me cry, actually.
Because my parents came from Germany and because we lost a lot of people in the Holocaust, exactly because of that legacy, I felt I could not be indifferent to the suffering of the Palestinians, nor did I want to be part of the society that caused these suffering.
I was always raised to believe that to be Jewish meant to stand for justice. I come from a family in which those two things were just synonymous.
And I thought justice was related to anti-racism. And I thought justice, as our dear friend Esther Farmer always said, is not just for us.
Yeah, there's actually a deliberate effort by Israel and its allies to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. meaning that Judaism is the same as Zionism. But no, Zionism is a political identity. They do that to suppress evidence of Israel's crimes and make you think that supporting Israel means you're on the side of Jewish people. But don't fall for it, girl. But now it's starting to crumble. Still not at the level of the policymakers, but definitely on the street with the people. And that's why actually the state of Israel is scared and doing its utmost to just do this nonsensical PR, which we're going to get into in the video as well. And the reason it's crumbling is thanks in no small part to a lot of Jewish voices who are saying, not in our name will you do this to Palestinian people. And it's funny, a friend of mine was telling me, why are you focusing on Jewish voices in this video? What about Palestinians?
The first order of business is ending the oppression of Palestinians and liberating Palestinians, not liberating Judaism.
But I also do think it's important to show the world that the Jews who stand with Israel don't have a monopoly of what it means to be Jewish.
No question,
and
no
that,
question.
as you guys have articulated so well, like the Jewish thing to do is to be in solidarity with Palestinians.
We take our aim from Palestinian partners. Our Palestinian partners, we consult all the time.
Right.
We've gotten this idea that speaking out as Jews is helpful right now.
These people that I've chosen to lip sync to this week, they embody the values of Jewish faith: truth, peace, and justice. And if you look at the political landscape of modern day Israel with all the political extremists and the openly racist officials in Netanyahu's government, there are no traces of that. But indeed, what about the Palestinians, right? What about their pain? Because we must talk about that. And for me, I feel like maybe it's too painful because it's too close to home. I mentioned it in my last video, but actually my dad was Palestinian. I'm half Lebanese, my mother's from Lebanon, but my dad was Palestinian. And he was born in 1946. So he was 2 years old when the state of Israel was formed. So they were asked to leave. Let's just call it that. And he grew up in refugee camps in Palestine and what later became Israel and then moved to Jordan. But I grew up as a very sheltered Palestinian. I grew up in Dubai, which is where my parents met and got married. So actually I cannot speak to the suffering of Palestinians who are living under constant threat with the bombs, and I don't know what that's like. So if we're going to talk about the healings of Palestinian people, we can't even talk about PTSD because there's no P, there's no post. It's just TSD. It's just constant trauma, ongoing. According to the World Health Organization, 5% of people living in war zones suffer from severe mental health conditions. Like if you look at the pictures that are coming out of Gaza Strip right now, I'm not gonna even talk about the people who are, losing limbs and screaming. I'm just gonna talk about the people who are shell-shocked, terrified. There are actually 3 or 4-year-olds who are going around looking for their parents. Imagine waking up as a 3-year-old and realizing your whole family is gone. You're on your own in the world. There are entire neighborhoods with homes wiped out, nothing to return to. And now it's winter there. So they have no homes, they're hungry, they're so thirsty, they're crying because they need water. There's actually an Israeli ban on medical supplies so that you can't even have painkillers like anesthesia for your wounds. And there are mothers who are giving birth with C-section with no painkiller. So how do these people even begin to heal? And by the way, this is no different than what Jewish people went through during the Holocaust. And speaking of the Holocaust, there's this man called Norman Finkelstein. He's an American scholar, American Jewish scholar, who has been documenting the plight of Palestinians for more than 40 years, most of his life. And he's actually guided, he says that he's guided by the spirit of his parents who suffered during the concentration camps, and in their memory, he does not allow that to happen to Palestinians. So of course I had to play him, because through him, I am allowed to touch the pain that I feel for Palestinians and for the part of me that is Palestinian. Because to face it head on is a little bit too much for me. So sometimes, and I do this in all areas of my life, every time something is very painful, I need some kind of a performance piece to kind of like ease my way towards my own pain. And I found the best person to touch that pain through is someone like Norman Finkelstein.
I don't like to play before an audience the Holocaust card, but since now I feel compelled to. My late father was in Auschwitz. My late mother, please shut up. My late father was in Auschwitz. My late mother was in Majdanek concentration camp. Every single member of my family on both sides was exterminated. And it's precisely and exactly because of the lessons my parents taught me and my two siblings, that I will not be silent when Israel commits its crimes against the Palestinians. And I consider nothing more despicable than to use their suffering to try to justify the torture, the brutalization, the demolition of homes that Israel daily commits against the Palestinians. If you had any heart in you, you would be crying for the Palestinians, not for what's being done.
Hey y'all, it's In Denial, your drag therapist, the only drag therapist. Maybe the algorithm is leading you to me for the first time because this is the first time I cover a topic like this. Normally I either do straight up drag lip sync stories and theater shows, or more popularly my reviews of Love is Blind and other reality shows. But now what's been happening for the last 7 weeks in Gaza has really fired me up, and I was for weeks thinking whether I should talk about it or not. And this leads me into what I mentioned briefly a couple of minutes ago, the shame that I've always had. And I can't help but think of the psychologist Ken Hardy, who wrote The Assaulted Sense of Self, which is basically when the oppressed take on the views of their oppressor and internalize them. You know, Malcolm X, long before he became the symbol of what people love him for, he said that he used to straighten his hair to look less black. And later on he said, who taught us to hate the shape of our lips and the shape of our nose? Basically, I say this to say that anyone who's experienced oppression because they're a minority, whether it's because you're queer or gay, you internalize the views of your oppressor. And actually, Jewish people themselves have gone through this. Gabor Mate, another Jewish person that I've lip-synced to many times before, not related to this subject, but because of his views on addiction, and addiction is a topic that I always cover. He grew up as a hardened Zionist, because also his parents, by the way, were Holocaust survivors, and later he was bullied for being Jewish, so he grew up ashamed of his Jewish identity. And then when the state of Israel came along and Zionism came along, it became this source of pride in being Jewish. But when you dive deep into what's really going on, and that kind of like pride in your identity is at the expense of other people, is on the backs of other people, on their suffering as well, you can't with a clear conscience say, okay, this is all right. By the way, before we go any further, I want to quickly just thank people who donated on my last video. Thank you so much for the love. And I also want to say that I've started the membership on my channel. So there's kind of different tiers that you can join. And there's going to be all sorts of perks in different tiers. Like there's going to be live streams where I give advice. Because I know when I did the poll, some of you voted for the advice. And some of these people really want it, but the majority voted for the long documentaries. Speaking of which, my next video, which I'm still working on, is the long documentary about the behind the scenes of all the reality and dating shows. So that's still coming up. So now let's get back to the topic of this video. By the way, they just announced that there's a truce. There's a humanitarian pause where they stop killing people for a few days. Palestinians are so lucky. And what this pause is gonna uncover is the havoc that was wreaked on Gaza, if they allow the reporters to go in, because, girl. Also, this is a time where I think the tide is shifting because there's a tsunami of support for Palestinian people all over the world, because a lot of people see themselves in Palestinians, whether it's queers or anyone from the global south or anyone who has been oppressed in any way. And you know the state of Israel is shaking in its boots because they're becoming a bit hysterical. Usually they've always been quite strategic and masters at playing the PR game, but now their attempts to cover things up is becoming a bit hysterical. Like, did you see that clip of the Israeli actress that they hired to play the Palestinian nurse who's scared in the Shifa hospital of what Hamas is doing to the hospital, even though they're the ones who are bombing it? But never mind, they hired this actress to play that she's Palestinian. And you can tell from her accent she's Israeli, but she's trying to put on this Palestinian accent. She's like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to do this like this and tell you about Hamas. But the world has to know about Hamas in the bombing in the hospital.
I can't believe I'm doing this, but the world has to know what Hamas is making here.
First of all, Meryl Streep, you are not, okay? You're a terrible actress. If you were scared, really scared of being under attack or about to die, Abject horror will be on your face. Tears will be running down your face. Snot, you will be hiding. We will feel the fear. Like you wouldn't be making a statement about PR. I cannot believe I'm about to say this, but the world has to know that Hamas. What? Shut the fuck up, girl.
Some claim the nurse in the video is actually Hana Abutbul, a former Israel TV actress. A journalist also claimed he spoke to the medical personnel at the hospital, who said they've never seen the woman.
Yeah, people are not buying this old narrative that Israel has been selling for the last 75 years to cover their occupation. Because corporate mainstream media is not the only source of information anymore. Because mainstream media has been in lockstep with the Israeli government for many years. Like CNN, MSNBC, they've always been trying to defend Israel, but even they right now can't anymore. Did you catch this clip where Christian Amanpour was interviewing the former Israeli prime minister? He literally said that they're the ones who built those tunnels. And Christian is like, hold on, girl. Did you misspeak? Did I just... She does this thing with her eyes. It's actually kind of cute.
It's already known for many years that they have in the bunkers that originally was built by Israeli constructors underneath Shifa.
Well, when you say it was built by Israeli engineers, did you misspeak?
No, decades ago we were running the place.
Okay, all right. Well, that's sort of thrown me a little bit.
Yeah, that's thrown me a little bit, and it's gonna take a little bit for me to help you defend yourself. But I'm gonna give it a whirl, girl, as we have been for the last decades, trying to protect Israel. But by the way, speaking of CNN, really mainstream media is no longer capable of doing this. There was a very telling interview with Anderson Cooper with this American nurse who was working in Gaza. It's a chilling interview of her account of the horror and the devastation that is happening in Gaza. And clearly you can tell they're instructed not to talk about the cause of this havoc. So there's this nurse who's telling him horrific stories, and Anderson Cooper is just taking it all in. But the ghost in the story is who's causing all this, but they just don't go near it, as if this death and destruction is just happening in a vacuum, like it's just happening. And Anderson Cooper is just like, and then he's like, thank you for coming on. She's like, thank you, and they leave it. It's clearly like they're instructed not to touch that subject. But this was weeks ago. Now it's like, now we have to talk about it.
And I think there is a shift in the narrative. It's beginning, even in the mainstream media.
And she's right, there is a shift. Not just in mainstream media, but also in like social media like TikTok.
$5,000 is what I was just offered to pledge my support to Israel. And I think this is absolutely disgusting. You cannot buy my support of a genocide.
You know, several of my close friends have been very curious about which angle this video is going to take. Because obviously it's impossible not to upset people when you talk about this subject. Like you can speak with the compassion of Buddha and you will still hurt somebody's feelings. And speaking of Buddha, by the way, he said that with our mind we create the world. But it's also true that the world around us creates our mind. Like if we're subjected to trauma, ongoing trauma, or even historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, that also informs our mind and the way we think, which will inform our life and the choices that we make. And I think there's a shared racial trauma between what's happening to Palestinians right now and Jewish people throughout history. So lately, in this past few weeks, I've been obsessed with how Jewish people think about this war. Because actually, when you think about it, I have a lot of empathy for Jewish people at this moment. Because this is a time of deep reckoning for them. Because they have to really look within and question the stuff that they've been brought up with. Mainly that Zionism and supporting the Zionist state of Israel is central to Jewish identity. But it's not true. And I know it's not true because so many Jewish voices that I've been reading and listening to in the past few weeks are brave enough to say no, not in our name. But of course, there are voices also worth listening to that are in complete denial. Like there's this channel here on YouTube. I'm gonna link it below. It's called The Ask Project. This guy goes around asking questions to Palestinians and Israelis. And over again, I'm gonna link one specific video where there's a girl in the middle of the video. She served in the army and she's here in the thumbnail. And over again, you hear the same message, how Israelis describe Palestinians as they believe that Palestinians hate them because of the way they've been indoctrinated. But girl, every Zionist accusation is actually a projection, because since they are young in Israeli society, they're already shaped to serve in the military, to protect Jews and make them safe. When in fact, very few are able to question, is what's going on right now just a continuation of the suffering from the Holocaust, or do we have a hand? Like, is the oppression of Palestinians to blame to what's going on at the moment? And there are, of course, voices like the ones I'm lip syncing to in this video, like Rose. Rose is actually a distinguished professor of political science, widely published feminist scholar. She grew up in a liberal Zionist family in Oklahoma. Her family believed in Israel and all of them went there. And she went there at 16 years old. And when she went to Israel at 16 years old, she started noticing racism on the kibbutz against black people. And when she came back home to the US, she started talking about it. And there was this older rabbi who basically just hushed her up, told everyone, don't listen, she's just a little girl.
For me, anti-racism, supporting Palestine, and feminism are completely interlinked.
And for Rose, the final straw where she really changed and started supporting Palestinian people was the 2014 Gaza war. Because this happened, by the way, in 2014. It's literally like Groundhog Day over there. And then you have Rabbi Brent Rosen, who's also part of Jewish Voices for Peace. And he's an American rabbi and blogger known for his pro-Palestinian activism. And his final straw was the 2008 war in Gaza. Told you, girl, Groundhog Day. This has been happening to Palestinians on a loop.
If you look at the mainstream media, when they go for comments about what's going on in the world, they go to Jewish establishment organizations that are thoroughly Zionist because they assume they speak for all Jews, which is just absolutely not true.
And then you have Norman Finkelstein, literally my favorite human on the face of this planet. He's almost got too much integrity, this guy. And recently he went on Piers Morgan, which I respect Piers Morgan for inviting him on. And he was very smart. Norman was very smart. He drew a comparison between how Susan Boyle, remember that woman who was on a singing competition show and then she became very successful later on in her life. And in the audition, she said, no one's ever given me a chance. No one's ever seen me. And I loved how Norman drew a comparison between that and the people in Gaza. But of course, times 10,000, but just to feel unseen, because actually what's happening to Palestinians, them and their suffering is unseen. And again, it's not because the people of the world are terrible, but because they just don't know. The propaganda has been so intense that it's isolated and prevented people from actually able to see what's going on with Palestinians. So why have Jewish voices like Norman Finkelstein and the others been silenced for so long? Why does their support get labeled as support for terror? This is one of the myths that is repeated to distract from the fact that Israel, the settler colonial project that it is in fact involved in religious violence and terror. If you break down the idea, and I know it's very hard for a lot of people, but think about it, kicking people out of their homes because you have a biblical right to their land, and then you dare to talk about religious violence. We're living in the upside down. We're in the sunken place, girl. But Ilan Pappe says it best. He's a professor and a scholar born to Jewish German parents who fled due to Nazi persecution in the 1930s and now finds himself talking about the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And he talks about how Israel is not the only settler colonial power that is actually kicking indigenous people out of their land.
It's not exceptional for a settler colonial movement to claim to be the indigenous people. And I think that's something that allows people who are part of settler colonial states like the United States, but are very familiar nowadays with their own history, to understand that actually it's not exceptional. The only exceptional part of it is the denial.
Speaking of the US, let's talk about the special bond between conservative America and Israel. The irony here is that the largest part of the Republican base that support Israel are actually anti-Semitic, if you check the doctrine. Like there's this guy who spoke at the rally for Israel. Christian Zionists like this guy could not care less about Jewish people, which is why it's so strange to suddenly have this weird arrangement between these hardcore Christian evangelicals and the progressive liberals who support Israel. Like suddenly they find themselves as strange bedfellows right now, like Sarah Silverman. Oh, by the way, I completely understand why she would be in support of Israel. Her sister is actually a rabbi, so she's probably very scared. But she actually supported cutting off the food, water, and electricity from the people of Gaza. The crazy thing is that people like Sarah Silverman, who are supporting Israel because of instinct to protect their loved ones, they're not seeing the irony in who's on their side right now.
The same people who hate Jews hate Black people. The same people who hate Muslims hate Jews.
Right.
I mean, that hatred, it is basically about white supremacy.
Actually, if you are part of a right-wing ideological movement, you'd be watching what Israel is doing to Palestinians right now with delight, how they're getting away with it. Yeah, the racist things that Israeli officials are allowed to utter under the guise of security, it's shocking, girl.
The dehumanization that Israel is allowed to express through its discourse, through its policies, through its activities, is not different from any racist approach by any other group.
Speaking of this deeply rooted racism and fear of the other, I want to cut to a quick montage of how mainstream media covered the plight of the Ukrainian people, how much empathy they have for Ukrainian people versus Palestinians. All these reporters are genuinely shocked to see people who look like them suffering. They can't even bring themselves like to hide it because it's so shocking. They're like, I mean, I don't know how to put it, but like, it's so weird to see like, you know, blonde white people suffering. It's crazy. Cause you know why? Because it's usually brown people who are under the rubble. Oh my God. But it's actually blonde people who are suffering. I'm feeling things. Oh my God. Good for you, bitch.
These are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. Children being killed every day with Putin's missile.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
What's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm looking to use the expression, these are prosperous middle class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
Isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades.
But recently, the journalist Candace Owens got a taste of that hypocrisy because she works for the Daily Wire, which is partly owned by Ben Shapiro, and she thought their views were always aligned because she's conservative as well. But what she realized, and she learned very quickly, is that when it comes to Israel, all bets are off. You cannot continue the same thing. Basically, you can't be critical of Israel. And actually, when she visited Israel, she also visited the West Bank, and she was very uncomfortable by how Palestinians are treated differently than Israelis there. And it reminded her of, she drew parallels between that and how black people were treated.
I actually did correlate it and said that that's why I felt weird walking through the Muslim quarters, and then they called me stupid and said that I didn't understand that.
Yeah, unless you agree with them, you're stupid. Unless you agree with them, you have to deny all of your experiential and academic knowledge. Otherwise, you're either stupid or an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew.
By the way, during that interview that Norman had with Candace Owens, he brought up some stuff about the brutality that Palestinians go through before this war, just the everyday brutality. I mean, there are rules governing Gaza that prevent them from getting chocolates, potato chips. Like, it's this daily humiliation of reminding Palestinians to just put their head down, that they're nothing. It keeps them just above starvation level. Girl, if you get into the literature and the research and the data on this, I know maybe a lot of the stuff that I'm saying now sounds like, oh, conspiracy theory, but these are proven facts. Like, there are human rights organizations around the world documenting all of this stuff. And also, it's crazy to me, like, why would not only millions of people marching in the street now be lying, why would Doctors Without Borders be lying? Amnesty International is lying. What? Human rights organizations within Israel. Red Cross is lying. Like, what's the benefit? Why would all these people be lying? You know, Israel is like what? Israel is like this abusive husband that has his wife locked up in the room. He controls when and how much she eats, how much light she gets, when she can go, when she can leave, and periodically beats her up and reminds her who's boss. And the second she gets a moment where she can fight back and she attacks him with whatever she has, and then that's when he goes like, oh my God, she attacked me. And he goes complaining to the whole world, oh, she cut me, she scratched me. And everyone's like, oh, let's put some Band-Aid. She's really terrorizing you. Because nobody sees. Well, people have started to see right now. But people have been blind. And speaking of that, by the way, I'm not trying to attack like Israeli citizens. And I can't help but think of one subscriber of mine who wrote a beautiful comment like on my last video. And she's a makeup artist from Israel, and she just said she wants to have peace. And I started watching her videos and I could see like there's such a kind person there. Yeah, I'm sure she would never want Palestinians to suffer, like many wouldn't. But the way the occupation is designed, it's designed specifically for Israelis not to see the suffering of Palestinians, to live in denial. Because most of us human beings are not evil. But we just turn a blind eye to things that are uncomfortable. We do it in our interpersonal relationships, we do it when we're struggling with addiction, and we do it on issues like that. But the truth is still the truth, girl.
I say this as an American Jew. My children go to Jewish day school. I lead services in an Orthodox synagogue. Judaism is the center of my life. The first time I went to spend time with Palestinians in the West Bank, it was a shattering experience. When you see people living under the control of the state with no rights, they cannot become citizens. They cannot vote for the state that controls their lives. They do not have free movement. They need a pass to move from city to city. They live under a military legal system. The consequences are more brutal than we can imagine sitting here. People need to go and see for themselves. I've never seen anyone who's gone and seen for themselves and not been transformed by the experience.
And I have no doubt that the fear Israelis fear for their life, thinking that Palestinians are out to get them, is real. They're not faking that. But that's what they've been taught since they were young, that Palestinians just wake up hating them because they're anti-Semites. No, there are anti-Semites in the world, but Palestinians don't hate the state of Israel because they hate Jewish people. They just hate being oppressed and humiliated on a daily basis. And they too are suffering, just like Jewish people have suffered in the past.
There's this insidious kind of Jewish attitude toward anti-Semitism, which is that it's somehow exceptional, that it's somehow a unique form of hatred, different from all others in the world, and that to be a Jew just means to be inherently unsafe.
And I actually want to go to another Jewish voice that I respect very much. He's actually Israeli. He's a reporter for the Haaretz. His name is Gideon Levy. He has been also documenting the suffering of Palestinians and the occupation for many years. I'm not going to lip sync to him because what he's saying it as an Israeli and he's talking to Israeli people. And I feel like it feels a little bit in poor taste for me to, I don't know, drag it up or do something with it because he's saying something very specific to Israeli from the Israeli point of view. So I'm just going to let him speak for himself.
I'll just give the 3 principles which enable us Israelis to live so easily. A, most of the Israelis, if not all of them, deeply believe that we are the chosen people. B, there were more brutal occupations in history, but there was never in history an occupation in which the occupier presented himself as the victim. This also enables any Israeli to live in peace because we are the victims. But the third set of values is the most dangerous one, and this is the systematic dehumanization of the Palestinians, because if they are not human beings like us, then there is not really a question of human rights.
There was actually a very chilling story that he wrote about this dehumanization of Palestinians because there are checkpoints in the West Bank, right? And one time he was driving behind an ambulance car, a Palestinian ambulance car that is waiting at the checkpoint.
I come to the checkpoint, a Palestinian ambulance is parking there with the red lights. The soldiers are playing backgammon in the tent. And I went out to the car, from the car. I went first to the Palestinian ambulance driver and I asked him, what's going on? He told me that's the routine. They let me wait 1 hour. And I went to the soldiers. The question that I asked them, which really brought them to direct their weapons toward me, what would have happened if your father would have been lying in this ambulance? How can I dare to compare between their father and the Palestinian in the ambulance?
I'm actually not sure how to end this video because this is the first time I venture into politics, but this is a lot more personal than just politics for me. But why drag and lip syncing while talking about this topic? For me, not only is this my art form, which is really the way I cope and understand the world around me and what's going on with me, but I saw this very interesting interview with a Jewish comedian called Larry Charles, and he was being interviewed by Larry King, and he mentioned that there were comedians actually on the concentration camps. Because at some point when you're on the edge of the cliff, when the suffering is so unbearable, when you don't know what to do with all the pain inside you, laughter is important. Feeling joy is important. It's almost as essential as breathing. And also specifically to me, because I'm not a comedian per se. I mean, I like laughter and making people laugh, but I consider myself more like a performance artist, and I love embodying other characters. And the idea of embodying Jewish people whose minds I have a lot of respect for, and their integrity and also their empathy, is kind of healing for me. And also it's a little bit of a distance, like I said in the beginning, because to just straight up talk about Palestinians and what they're suffering is a little too painful. Honestly, because when I think of Palestinian kids, I just start crying.
Now I'll tell you something, Candice. I live in an apartment building. I go into my elevator, and there will be a parent with the kids. And I look at the kids, and like an old man that I am, I say hello to the kids, smile to the kids. And all of a sudden, I get overcome with this sick feeling because I look at the kid, and then I see those pictures from Gaza.